The snow fell in thick, merciless curtains across the Montana wilderness, each flake a frozen needle against Sarah Stewart's face as she stumbled through the drifts. Her hands, raw and bleeding from clawing at ice-covered rocks, trembled as she pressed them against the rough bark of a pine tree. The world around her existed only in sounds and textures now. The whisper of wind through branches, the crunch of snow beneath her worn boots, the distant howl of something old and hungry in the darkness. 3 days had passed since the stagecoach accident. 3 days since the driver's terrified screams had cut through the mountain air before falling silent forever. 3 days since she had crawled from the wreckage, her sight stolen by the same blow that had killed the others, leaving her alone in a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak or the lost. Her fingers found the jagged scar that ran from her left temple to her cheekbone, still tender to the touch. The mirror in her Denver boarding house had shown her the damage before she left civilization behind. The clouded, unseeing eyes. The mark that branded her as broken, unwanted. She had heard the whispers in the streets, seen the way people turned away. Who would want a blind woman? What man could love something so damaged? The memory of Jonathan Mendoza's words still burned in her chest like swallowed glass. She had loved him once, trusted him with dreams of a future together. But when the fever took her sight 6 months ago, his visits had grown shorter, his excuses more elaborate. The final conversation played in her mind with cruel clarity. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I can't do this anymore. A man needs a wife who can see to his needs, tend his home properly. You understand, don't you? I'm not built for this kind of burden." Burden. The word had followed her from Denver to the mining camps, from the mining camps to this godforsaken wilderness where she had hoped to disappear entirely. But even here, death seemed reluctant to claim her quickly. A branch snapped somewhere to her left, and Sarah froze. Not the wind this time. Something moved through the forest with purpose, its footsteps too heavy and deliberate to be anything but human. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the tree, trying to become invisible in a world where she could see nothing. The footsteps stopped. "You're making enough noise to wake the dead," a man's voice said, low and rough as gravel. "And in these mountains, that's not just a saying." Sarah's breath caught. She had heard no one approach, yet the voice seemed to come from mere feet away. "Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Her hands fumbled for the small Sumad knife she had kept in her coat pocket, the blade that had served as her only protection since the accident. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I have nothing worth taking." A sound that might have been laughter, bitter and short. "Nothing worth taking. Lady, you've got something most folks around here would kill for. You're still breathing." The footsteps resumed, circling her slowly. Sarah turned her head, trying to track the sound, but the snow muffled everything, made distances impossible to judge. She was a rabbit caught in the open, and this man was the wolf. "Please," she said, hating the tremor in her voice. "I'm just trying to find shelter. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble's already found you. Question is whether you're smart enough to accept help when it's offered." The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. She could feel his presence like heat from a fire, could smell wood smoke and leather and something wild that spoke of long days in the mountains. "Who are you?" she asked. "Name's Timothy Allen, and you're about 10 minutes from freezing to death if you don't move." Timothy Allen. She had heard the name whispered in the mining camps, always with a mixture of fear and respect. The mountain man who lived alone in the high country, who appeared like a ghost when travelers went missing and sometimes brought them back alive. They said he was half wild himself, more comfortable with wolves than with people. They said he had killed men with his bare hands and left their bodies for the scavengers. They also said he had never hurt a woman or child, no matter how desperate the circumstances. "I can't see," she said, the words falling from her lips like stones. "The accident, it took my sight. I can't follow you anywhere." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of falling snow. Sarah waited for the sound of retreating footsteps, for the familiar pattern of abandonment that had defined her life since the fever. Instead, she heard something unexpected. "Then you won't see me cry," Timothy Allen said, his voice softer now. touched with something that might have been understanding. Before she could process the meaning behind his words, Sarah felt something warm and heavy settle around her shoulders. A coat, thick with fur and smelling of pine smoke and mountain air. The weight of it nearly drove her to her knees. "I don't need your pity," she said, though her fingers clutched at the warmth instinctively. "Good thing I'm not offering any." His voice had moved again, somewhere to her right now. "What I'm offering is a choice. You can stay here and let the cold take you, or you can trust me to get you somewhere warm. But decide quick, this storm's getting worse, and I've got no interest in carrying a frozen corpse down the mountain." The wind picked up as if summoned by his words, driving snow through the trees with renewed fury. Sarah felt it cut through her thin dress like knives, felt the numbness creeping up from her toes. She had perhaps an hour before the cold claimed her completely. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me. I know you've been walking in circles for the better part of 3 days. I know you haven't eaten since the accident, and I know you're too proud to ask for help even when you're dying. That's enough. How do you know about the accident?" "Found the wreckage yesterday. Buried what was left of the driver. Figured there might have been passengers, so I started looking." A pause. "Didn't expect to find anyone alive." The simple words carried weight that made Sarah's chest tight. Someone had cared enough to look. Someone had taken the time to bury a stranger with dignity. In her months of blindness, she had grown accustomed to being overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. The idea that this rough mountain man had searched for survivors when no one else would even know to look struck her like a physical blow. "I don't have any money," she said. "Nothing to pay you with." "Didn't ask for payment. Then what do you want?" Another silence, longer this time. When Timothy Allen spoke again, his voice carried a note she couldn't quite identify, something raw and carefully hidden. "Maybe I'm tired of talking to myself." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable in a way that seemed to surprise them both. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of despair that had lived there since the fever took her sight. Here was a man who understood loneliness, who knew what it meant to be set apart from the world. "I can't cook," she said suddenly. "I can't clean properly, can't mend clothes or tend a fire. I'm useless as a companion. You can listen." 2 words, but they carried the weight of years. Sarah felt tears freeze on her cheeks before she realized she was crying. When was the last time someone had wanted nothing more from her than her presence? When had anyone suggested that she, broken and blind and burdensome, might have something to offer? "I don't even know if I can trust you," she whispered. "Smart woman. You shouldn't trust anyone out here. But right now I'm the only chance you've got." A tree branch cracked somewhere in the forest, heavy with snow. The sound made Sarah flinch, reminded her of the accident, of the terrible moment when the world had gone dark and silent, except for her own screaming. She was so tired of being afraid, so tired of feeling helpless and small. "If I go with you," she said, "and you try to hurt me—" "You'll what? Fight me off with that little knife you're clutching?" Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. She hadn't realized her grip on the weapon was so obvious. "I'll find a way," she said, trying to inject steel into her voice. "I'm sure you would." There was something that might have been approval in his tone. Woman who survives 3 days alone in these mountains after losing her sight isn't someone to underestimate. The unexpected praise made her throat tight. Jonathan had never spoken to her that way, never suggested she was capable of anything beyond being a burden. Even before the fever, he had treated her like a fragile ornament, something to be protected and displayed, but never truly respected. "Where would we go?" she asked. "Got a cabin about 2 miles up the ridge. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. Got food enough for both of us through the winter." Winter, the word carried implications that made Sarah's stomach clench. She had been thinking in terms of days, maybe weeks. But winter in the Montana mountains could last for months. Months alone with a stranger, dependent on his charity, his protection, his continued goodwill. "I won't be your woman," she said quickly. "If that's what you're expecting in return for shelter, you can leave me here." "Wouldn't want you if you were willing," Timothy said, and there was something dark in his voice now, something that spoke of old wounds and careful distances. I'm not looking for a wife or a lover, just someone who won't try to change me or fix me or make me into something I'm not. The honesty in his words struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man who had been hurt too, who had learned to protect himself by expecting nothing from others. Sarah understood that kind of pain, the way it made you build walls so high that even kindness couldn't scale them. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "Same thing that happened to you, I'd guess. Life." The snow was falling harder now, and Sarah could feel the temperature dropping with each gust of wind. Her feet had gone numb inside her boots, and the borrowed coat, warm as it was, couldn't protect her from the cold that seemed to seep up from the frozen ground itself. "I need to decide now, don't I?" she said. "Now would be good." Sarah closed her useless eyes and tried to think. She could stay here and die with dignity, freeze to death rather than become dependent on a stranger's charity. It would be clean, final, an end to the months of struggling to find her place in a world that had no use for broken things. Or she could take the risk, trust a man she had never seen, follow him into the wilderness, and hope that his offer of shelter came without a price she wasn't willing to pay. It meant accepting help, admitting that she couldn't survive alone. It meant swallowing her pride and acknowledging that she needed someone else to live. "I'll come with you," she said, the words torn from her throat like splinters. "Smart choice." His voice was closer now, and she felt a large, calloused hand touch her elbow gently. "We'll take it slow. Tell me if you need to rest." The contact sent a shock through her system. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with simple human kindness, without pity or revulsion. Timothy's hand was steady and warm, offering support without making her feel helpless. They began to walk, Timothy guiding her carefully around obstacles she couldn't see. Tree roots and fallen logs, patches of ice that would have sent her sprawling. His pace was patient, unhurried despite the worsening storm. When she stumbled, he steadied her without comment. When she needed to rest, he simply stopped and waited. "Tell me about the cabin," she said after they had walked in silence for what felt like an hour. "Built it myself about 5 years ago. One room, stone fireplace, good roof. Got a well that doesn't freeze, and a root cellar stocked with enough supplies to last through spring." "You live alone?" "Always have. Always figured I always would." There was something in his voice that made Sarah want to ask more questions, but she sensed the walls going up again. This was a man who had learned to be self-sufficient, who trusted no one but himself. The fact that he was helping her at all seemed like a miracle. "Why did you come to the mountains?" She asked instead. A long pause. "Same reason you were heading into them, I'd guess. Sometimes a man needs to get as far from other people as he can." Sarah understood that feeling. After the fever, after Jonathan's abandonment, after the endless parade of pitying looks and awkward silences, she had dreamed of disappearing entirely. The mountains had seemed like the perfect place to vanish, to become nothing more than another cautionary tale about city folks who ventured too far on into the wilderness. "What did you do before?" she pressed gently. "Lot of things, none of them worth talking about." The finality in his voice told her not to push further. Everyone had secrets, especially people who chose to live alone in places where civilization couldn't reach them. Sarah had her own secrets, her own reasons for wanting to disappear. She could respect his need for privacy. They walked on through the storm, two damaged souls making their way through a landscape that cared nothing for their pain or their hopes. Sarah found herself focusing on the rhythm of their footsteps, the steady crunch of snow beneath their boots. It was almost meditative, this careful progress through the darkness. "How much farther?" she asked when her legs began to shake with exhaustion. "Not far, maybe another half-mile." But even as he spoke, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. A howl, long and mournful, echoing through the trees. It was answered by another, then another, until the forest seemed alive with the voices of predators. "Wolves," Timothy said, his voice tight with tension. "They've caught our scent." Sarah felt her knees go weak. She had heard the stories, knew what happened to travelers caught in the open when wolf packs were hunting. Her hand found Timothy's arm, gripping it with desperate strength. "Can we outrun them?" "Not in this snow. Not with you." He stopped himself, but Sarah heard the unfinished thought. "Not with a blind woman slowing him down." "Leave me," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "You can move faster alone. I'll hide, try to find a tree to climb." "Like hell." Timothy's voice was hard as iron. "We stick together. Both of us make it, or neither of us does." Another howl, closer this time. Sarah could hear movement in the underbrush, the soft pad of paws on snow. They were being surrounded, cut off from escape routes she couldn't even see. "How many?" she whispered. "Too many." Timothy's hand moved to something at his belt, and Sarah heard the whisper of steel being drawn. A knife or maybe a hatchet. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be enough against a pack of hungry wolves. "There," Timothy said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of hope. "Light ahead, the cabin." Sarah strained to see what he was seeing, but her world remained stubbornly dark. She had to trust that he was right, that salvation lay somewhere ahead in the swirling snow. They began to move faster, Timothy's hand firm on her arm as he guided her over rough ground. Behind them, the wolves were closing in, their howls growing louder and more urgent. Sarah could hear individual animals now, the snap of twigs under their paws, the harsh sound of their breathing. "Almost there," Timothy said, but his voice was strained with effort and something that might have been fear. Sarah's foot caught on something, a root or a rock, and she went down hard. Pain shot through her knee as she hit the frozen ground, and she cried out despite herself. Timothy hauled her to her feet, but the delay had cost them precious seconds. The first wolf appeared like a shadow made flesh, its growl a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sarah couldn't see it, but she could feel its presence, could smell the wild musk of its fur and the copper scent of old blood on its breath. "Get behind me," Timothy said, pushing her back with one hand while raising his weapon with the other. But even as Sarah stumbled backward, she heard more wolves emerging from the forest around them. They were surrounded, trapped between predators and a cabin that might as well have been a mile away. The pack leader snarled, a sound that promised death in tearing teeth. Sarah felt Timothy tense beside her, preparing for a fight he couldn't possibly win. And in that moment, with death closing in from all sides and nowhere left to run, Sarah Stewart realized that she didn't want to die after all. The pack leader's yellow eyes gleamed in the darkness, its massive form coiled like a spring ready to unleash death. Sarah felt Timothy's body tense beside her, heard the whisper of steel as he adjusted his grip on whatever weapon he carried. The other wolves had formed a loose circle around them, their growls creating a symphony of menace that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. "When I say run," Timothy whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind, "you head straight toward my voice. Don't stop, don't look back, don't think, just run." "I can't see where I'm going," Sarah whispered back, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the wolves could hear it. "Trust me to guide you." Trust, such a simple word, yet it carried the weight of her life in this moment. Sarah had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, that the people who claimed to care for her would abandon her the moment she became inconvenient. But here in the frozen wilderness was Barunas, with death circling them like vultures. She had no choice but to place her faith in a man she barely knew. The pack leader took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the snow. Sarah could smell its wild musk now, could hear the soft panting of the other wolves as they prepared to attack. Her fingers found the small knife in her pocket, though she knew it would be useless against creatures built for killing. Timothy shifted his weight, and Sarah heard him take a deep breath. She braced herself for his signal, for the desperate sprint toward a cabin she couldn't see, through a forest filled with predators that could run her down in seconds. But the attack never came. Instead, a new sound cut through the night, the sharp crack of a rifle followed immediately by another. The pack leader yelped and stumbled, dark blood staining the snow beneath its feet. The other wolves scattered, their courage broken by the unexpected assault from an unseen enemy. "This way, quickly now," a new voice called out, older and rougher than Timothy's, "before they regroup." Timothy's hand found Sarah's elbow, guiding her forward with urgent haste. "That's Ralph Wood," he said, his voice tight with relief and something else. "Surprise, maybe? Or wariness? Lives about a mile down the ridge." They stumbled through the snow toward the voice, Sarah's legs shaking with exhaustion and delayed terror. Behind them, she could hear the wolves regrouping, their howls filled with rage and frustration. The rifle cracked again, and the sounds of the pack began to fade as they retreated deeper into the forest. "In here, by," Ralph Wood called, and Sarah felt Timothy guide her up wooden steps and through a doorway. Warmth hit her like a physical blow, so sudden and overwhelming that she nearly collapsed. The scent of wood smoke and coffee filled her nostrils, along with something else. The smell of a place where someone lived alone for too long, where human presence had grown thin and strange. "Close call," Ralph said, and Sarah heard the sound of a rifle being set down, the scrape of a chair being pulled out. "Saw the pack moving through the trees about an hour ago. Biggest one I've seen in years. You're lucky I was watching." "We're grateful," Timothy said, but there was something guarded in his voice now. Sarah sensed undercurrents she didn't understand, tensions between the two men that ran deeper than simple neighborly concern. "Coffee's hot," Ralph continued, apparently oblivious to Timothy's wariness. "Got some stew on the stove, too, if you're hungry. Lady looks like she could use a good meal." Sarah felt heat flood her cheeks. Even in her blindness, she was aware of how she must appear. Thin from days without food, her dress torn and dirty from her stumbling journey through the forest, her hair wild and tangled with snow. She probably looked like exactly what she was, a woman at the end of her rope, dependent on the charity of strangers. "That's kind of you," she managed, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Least I can do. Name's Ralph Wood, by the way. Been living up here about as long as Timothy, though I don't see much of him these days." There was something pointed in that last comment, a suggestion of old grievances or disappointments. Timothy helped Sarah to a chair near what she assumed was the fireplace. The heat felt wonderful against her frozen skin, though it made her injuries ache with renewed intensity. She became aware of just how badly she was hurt. The gash on her forehead throbbed with each heartbeat. Her knee was swollen and stiff from her fall, and her hands were raw from clawing at rocks and ice. "You're bleeding," Ralph observed, his voice closer now. "That's a nasty cut on your head." "I'll attend to it," Timothy said quickly, but Ralph made a dismissive sound. "Sit down, Timothy. I've got medical supplies here, and I've patched up worse than this." Sarah heard footsteps moving away, the sound of cabinets being opened and closed. "What happened to you, miss, if you don't mind me asking?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but the warmth of the cabin and the kindness in Ralph's voice made her defenses crumble. "Stagecoach accident. 3 days ago. I was the only survivor." "Jesus," Ralph breathed. 3 days in this weather, and you can't—" He stopped himself, but Sarah heard the unfinished thought. "I'm blind," she said simply. "Lost my sight to fever 6 months ago." Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind howling outside. Sarah waited for the familiar sounds of discomfort, the shuffling feet and cleared throats that always followed her admission. Instead, she heard Ralph moving around again, gathering supplies. "Well," he said finally, "you're tougher than most folks who come through these mountains with all their faculties intact. Takes real grit to survive what you've been through." The simple acceptance in his words made Sarah's throat tight. When was the last time someone had acknowledged her strength rather than focusing on her limitations? "Hold still, now, Sham," Ralph said, and Sarah felt gentle hands examining the cut on her forehead. His touch was clinical but kind, the hands of someone who had tended wounds before. "This is going to need cleaning. It might sting a bit." The antiseptic burned like fire, but Sarah bit back her cry. She had endured worse pain in the past few days, and she refused to show weakness now. Ralph worked with quiet efficiency, cleaning the wound and applying what felt like a bandage. "There," he said finally. "That should heal up clean if you keep it dry. Now let's have a look at that knee." As Ralph examined her other injuries, Sarah became aware of Timothy moving restlessly around the cabin. She could hear his footsteps, the soft sound of him checking the windows, the scrape of a chair being moved. He was agitated about something, though she couldn't understand what. "Timothy," Ralph said without looking up from Sarah's knee, "you're wearing a hole in my floor. Sit down and have some coffee." "We should be moving on," Timothy replied, "soon as the storm passes." "Storm's not passing anytime soon. Radio says this front's going to sit on us for at least another day, maybe 2. You're not taking this lady back out in that weather." She's not your concern, Ralph. The words were sharp enough to cut, and Sarah felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Ralph's hand stilled on her knee, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of steel. Everything that happens in these mountains is my concern, Timothy Allen. You know that better than most. The tension between the two men was thick enough to taste, and Sarah found herself caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. Old grievances, old wounds that had never properly healed. She cleared her throat softly, trying to break the silence that had fallen over the cabin. I don't want to cause trouble between you, she said. If there's somewhere else we can go. There isn't, Ralph said firmly, his attention returning to her injured knee. Not in this weather, and you're not causing trouble, miss. Some folks just have a hard time accepting help, even when they need it. Timothy made a sound that might have been a growl. I don't need anything from you, Ralph. No, then why are you here instead of at your own cabin? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah waited for Timothy's response, but none came. She heard him move to what she assumed was a window, heard the soft sound of curtains being pushed aside. Wolves are still out there, he said finally, circling the cabin. They'll move on once they realize we're not easy prey, Ralph replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely certain. Pack that size, though, they're probably desperate. Game's been scarce this winter. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. How many were there where? 8, maybe 10, Timothy said. More so than I've seen together in years. Hunger makes them bold, Ralph added, his hand still working on Sarah's knee. Makes them willing to take risks they wouldn't normally consider. Like attacking humans, Sarah thought, but didn't say. She had heard the stories, knew that wolves typically avoided people unless they were starving or protecting their young. A pack that size, desperate enough to surround armed humans, suggested that the winter had been harder than anyone realized. This is gonna hurt, Ralph warned, and Sarah felt him manipulate her injured knee. Pain shot up her leg, sharp and immediate, but the joint moved more freely afterward. Not broken, but you've got some torn ligaments. You'll need to stay off it for a few days. A few days. The words settled over Sarah like a blanket she didn't want. A few days trapped in a cabin with two men who clearly had unresolved issues between them. A few days of being dependent on strangers, of being the burden that everyone had to work around. I can walk, she said, testing her weight on the injured leg. Pain flared, but she managed to stay upright. Walking and walking well are two different things, Ralph observed. You try to travel on that knee before it's healed, you'll do permanent damage. Is that what you want? No, it wasn't what she wanted, but neither was being trapped here, caught between two men whose history she didn't understand. Sarah had learned to be self-sufficient, to depend on no one but herself. The idea of being helpless, of having no choice but to accept charity, made her skin crawl. I'll make up a bed for you by the fire, Ralph continued, apparently taking her silence for agreement. Timothy, you can have the spare room if you want it. I'll sleep by the door, Timothy said curtly. Suit yourself. Ralph's voice carried a note of old exasperation, as if this was a familiar pattern between them. But you might as well be comfortable while you're being stubborn. Sarah heard Timothy move again, settling himself somewhere near what she assumed was the cabin's entrance. The sound of him checking his weapons, the soft scrape of metal on leather. He was preparing for trouble, though whether from wolves or something else she couldn't tell. Ralph, she said quietly, may I ask how you know Timothy? A long pause filled with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind around the cabin's walls. When Ralph finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. We go back a ways, used to work together before he decided he preferred his own company. Work together at what? Another pause, longer this time. Sarah sensed that she was treading on dangerous ground, approaching secrets that both men would prefer to keep buried. Law enforcement, Timothy said from his position by the door, his voice flat and emotionless. Long time ago. The admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Law enforcement. That explained the tension, the way Timothy carried himself, the careful way he watched everything around him. It also raised questions that Sarah wasn't sure she wanted answered. What happened? She asked softly. Same thing that always happens, Ralph said, his hands busy with medical supplies as he cleaned up. Good men trying to do right in a world that doesn't much care about right or wrong. That's enough, Timothy said sharply. But Ralph wasn't finished. She has a right to know who she's traveling with, Timothy, especially if she's going to be staying in your cabin. She doesn't need to know anything except that I'll keep her safe. Will you? Because your track record on keeping people safe isn't exactly spotless. The words hit Timothy like physical blows. Sarah heard him take a sharp breath, heard the sound of his fists clenching. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. That's enough, Ralph. Is it? Because I seem to remember a time when you promised to keep someone else safe, and that didn't work out so well. Did it? Sarah felt the air leave the room as if someone had opened all the windows at once. Whatever Ralph was referring to, it cut Timothy to the bone. She heard him stand up, heard his footsteps moving toward the door. Where are you going? Ralph called after him. To check the perimeter, make sure those wolves haven't decided to come back. The door opened and closed, letting in a blast of cold air and snow. Timothy was gone, leaving Sarah alone with a man she didn't know and secrets she didn't understand. I shouldn't have said that, Ralph muttered, more to himself than to her. Old wounds run deep up here. Sometimes they fester instead of healing. What did he do? Sarah asked. What happened that you blame him for? Ralph was quiet for a long time, and Sarah could hear him moving around the cabin, putting away medical supplies, checking the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old grief. Timothy was a good lawman, one of the best I ever worked with, but he had a weakness for lost causes, for people who needed saving. Ralph paused, and Sarah heard him settle into a chair near the fire. There was a woman, Joyce Flores. She was married to a man named Christopher, a rancher who had a mean streak and fists to match. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She could already guess where this story was heading. Joyce came to us for help, showed us the bruises, the broken bones, but every time we tried to arrest Christopher, she'd change her story, say she'd fallen down the stairs or walked into a door. Timothy, he couldn't let it go. He was convinced he could save her if he just tried hard enough. What happened? Christopher found out that Joyce had been talking to us, beat her so bad she never woke up. By the time we got there, it was too late. Ralph's voice was barely above a whisper now. Timothy blamed himself. Said if he'd just minded his own business, if he'd left well enough alone, she might still be alive. The pieces began to fall into place in Sarah's mind. Timothy's isolation, his reluctance to get involved with other people's problems, the way he had hesitated before offering to help her. He was a man carrying the weight of a failure that wasn't entirely his fault, punishing himself for trying to do the right thing. That's why he lives alone, she said. That's why he lives alone, Ralph confirmed. Can't forgive himself for not being able to save someone who didn't want to be saved. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and Sarah could hear the scratch of tree branches against the cabin's walls. Somewhere in that storm, Timothy was walking alone, carrying his guilt like a stone in his chest. He saved me, Sarah said quietly. Did he? Or did he just postpone the inevitable? The question hit her like a slap. Was that what this was? A temporary reprieve before she inevitably became too much trouble? Too much of a burden? Would Timothy eventually abandon her the way Jonathan had, the way everyone else had? I don't know, she admitted. Neither do I, but I know Timothy Allen, and I know he's got a good heart under all that armor he wears. Question is whether he'll let himself care about someone again, or if he'll find a way to push you away before he gets too attached. The door opened again, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the scent of the wild. Timothy stamped his feet and closed the door behind him, his breathing harsh from cold and exertion. Wolves are gone, he announced, his voice carefully neutral. Tracks head north toward the high country. Good, Ralph said. Maybe we can all get some sleep. But sleep seemed impossible with the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. Sarah could feel the weight of unspoken words, of old wounds that refused to heal. She was an intruder here, caught between two men whose friendship had been broken by tragedy and guilt. I should tell you, she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. I'm not some innocent victim who needs rescuing. I came to these mountains to do. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Sarah felt heat flood her cheeks, but she forced herself to continue. After I lost my sight, after my fiance left me, I couldn't see the point in going on. Everyone looked at me like I was broken, useless. I thought maybe if I just walked far enough into the wilderness, the cold or the wolves or something would finish what the fever started. She heard Timothy move, his footsteps crossing the cabin toward her chair by the fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft and rough with emotion. What changed your mind? Sarah thought about the question, about the moment in the forest when she had realized she didn't want to die after all. I think it was when you said you were tired of talking to yourself. I realized I was tired of being alone with my own thoughts, tired of believing that being broken meant being worthless. You're not broken, Timothy said, and there was fierce conviction in his voice. Damaged maybe, hurt but not broken. How can you be so sure? Because broken things don't survive 3 days alone in the mountains. Broken things don't keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. You're not broken, Sarah Stewart. You're just learning how to be strong in a different way. The words hit her like warm sunlight after a long winter. When was the last time someone had seen strength in her instead of weakness? When had anyone suggested that her struggles had made her stronger rather than smaller? Timothy's right, Ralph added quietly. I've seen a lot of people come through these mountains over the years. Most of them don't last a day when things go bad. You've got something special, something that kept you alive when you should have died. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks and didn't bother to wipe them away. For months, she had defined herself by what she had lost, her sight, her independence, her future with Jonathan. She had forgotten that she might have gained something too. Resilience, maybe. The kind of strength that came from surviving the unsurvivable. I don't feel strong, she admitted. Strength isn't about feeling strong, Timothy said. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared, even when you can't see the way forward. You've been doing that since the moment you crawled out of that stagecoach wreckage. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The tension between Timothy and Ralph hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something else. Understanding, maybe. Recognition that they were all carrying wounds that might never fully heal. We should try to get some sleep, Ralph said eventually. Morning will bring new challenges, and we'll need to be ready for them. He helped Sarah arrange blankets by the fire, creating a makeshift bed that was more comfortable than anything she had experienced in days. The warmth of the flames felt wonderful against her aching body. And for the first time since the accident, she began to believe that she might actually survive. Timothy settled himself by the door, his back against the wall, and his weapons within easy reach. Even in sleep, he would be ready for trouble. It was the posture of a man who had learned not to trust the world to leave him in peace. Timothy, Sarah called softly into the darkness. Yeah? Thank you for not leaving me in the forest. A long pause, filled with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind around the cabin walls. Thank you for not giving up. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard. Joyce Flores, the woman Timothy hadn't been able to save. The guilt he carried, the way it had driven him to isolation and self-punishment. She understood that kind of pain. The way failure could eat at you from the inside until you forgot how to hope for better things. But she also understood something else now. Timothy Allen was a man worth saving, even if he didn't believe it himself. And maybe, just maybe, she was a woman worth saving too. The fire burned low as the night wore on, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside, 3 damaged souls had found temporary shelter from the cold. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. Sarah drifted towards sleep with the sound of Timothy's breathing in her ears, steady and reassuring. He was keeping watch, standing guard against the darkness that threatened to swallow them all. And for the first time in months, she felt safe. But safety was a fragile thing in the Montana wilderness, and morning would bring new challenges that would test them all. The storm was only the beginning. Somewhere in the mountains, other dangers were stirring, drawn by the scent of vulnerability and the promise of easy prey. The wolves had retreated, but they hadn't gone far. And wolves, Sarah was beginning to understand, came in many different forms. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana wilderness, though Sarah couldn't see the pale light filtering through the cabin's frost-covered windows. She woke to the sound of voices, low and urgent, and the smell of coffee brewing over the fire. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but the warmth of the blankets and the roof over her head felt like luxury after days in the open. "Storm's passing," Ralph was saying, his voice carrying from somewhere near what she assumed was a window. "But the snow's deep, 3, maybe 4 feet in places." "We can manage it," Timothy replied, though there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Sarah sat up carefully, testing her injured knee. It was stiff and sore, but the pain was manageable. Ralph's treatment had helped more than she had expected. "Good morning," and she said, and both men turned toward her. "Morning," and Ralph replied. "Coffee's ready if you want some. Got some biscuits warming by the fire, too." The kindness in his voice made her throat tight. When was the last time someone had prepared breakfast for her without being asked? When had anyone shown her such simple, uncomplicated care? "That's very kind," she managed. Timothy helped her to a chair near the fire, his touch gentle but impersonal. Sarah could sense the walls going back up around him, the careful distance he maintained from everyone around him. In the harsh light of morning, his moment of vulnerability the night before seemed like something she might have imagined. "We should be able to make it to my cabin by midday," he said, settling back into his position by the door. "If we take it slow." "You sure about that?" Ralph asked. "That knee of hers isn't going to handle rough terrain well." "I'll be fine," Sarah said quickly, though she wasn't sure that was true. The thought of another long trek through the snow, of stumbling blind through drifts and over obstacles she couldn't see, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "You don't have to prove anything," Timothy said quietly. "If you need more time to heal, I don't want to be a burden any longer than necessary." The words came out sharper than she had intended, and she felt both men react to them. Sarah bit her lip, wishing she could take them back. But the truth was, she was terrified of becoming too comfortable here, of allowing herself to depend on these men's charity. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with conditions, that people who seemed caring but could turn cold when inconvenience outweighed compassion. "You're not a burden," Ralph said firmly, "and anyone who's made you feel like one is a fool." Jonathan's face flashed in Sarah's mind, the look of barely concealed disgust he had worn during their final conversation. "You understand, don't you? I'm not built for this kind of burden." The memory still had the power to cut her to the bone. "My fiancé didn't think so," she said quietly. "Then he wasn't much of a pal," Timothy said, his voice hard as granite. The fierce conviction in his words surprised her. Sarah had grown accustomed to people making excuses for Jonathan's behavior, suggesting that she should understand his position, that caring for a blind woman was too much to ask of any man. But Timothy's anger on her behalf was immediate and genuine. He said he needed a wife who could see to his needs properly. Sarah continued, not sure why she was sharing something so painful. "That he wasn't built for taking care of someone like me." "Someone like you?" Ralph's voice carried a dangerous edge. What exactly did he mean by that? Broken, useless, a burden that would drag him down. The silence that followed her words was thick with anger. Sarah could feel both men's rage on her behalf, could sense the way her story had affected them. It was strange to have strangers defend her when the man who had claimed to love her had found her so easy to abandon. "What was his name?" Timothy asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Wayo. Just curious." Sarah heard something in his tone that made her glad she couldn't see his expression. There was violence there, carefully controlled, but ready to be unleashed. "Jonathan Mendoza," she said, "but he's in Denver, far from here." "Good thing for him," Timothy muttered. A knock at the door interrupted the conversation, sharp and urgent in the morning stillness. All three of them froze, and Sarah felt the atmosphere in the cabin shift from warm companionship to wary alertness. "You expecting anyone?" Timothy asked Ralph, his hand moving to his weapon. "No one comes up here this time of year," Ralph replied, moving toward the door with careful steps, "especially not after a storm like that." Another knock, more insistent this time. Ralph paused with his hand on the door latch, looking back toward Timothy. Some silent communication passed between them. Years of partnership of allowing them to coordinate without words. "Who's there?" Ralph called out. "Eugene Davis?" came the reply, muffled by the door in the wind. "From the mining camp down the valley. I need help." Ralph and Timothy exchanged glances again. Sarah could sense their wariness, though she didn't understand its source. The name Eugene Davis meant nothing to her, but it clearly meant something to them. "What kind of help?" Ralph asked. "My daughter's missing. Linda Hughes, she works at the camp. She was supposed to come home 2 days ago, but she never showed up. Storm's been too bad to search properly, but now that it's clearing." Sarah heard Ralph curse softly under his breath. A missing woman in the mountains, in winter, after a storm like the one they had just weathered. The chances of finding her alive were slim to none. "How old is she?" Ralph called through the door. 23. She's a good girl, responsible. She wouldn't just wander off." Timothy was on his feet now, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. Sarah realized that he was preparing to help with the search, despite his earlier declarations about minding his own business. The man who claimed to want nothing to do with other people's problems couldn't ignore a missing woman. Ralph opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air and a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Eugene Davis was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His clothes were soaked with snow and his eyes were wild with worry. "Thank God you're here," he said, looking between Ralph and Timothy. "I was hoping you might help with the search. You know these mountains better than anyone." "When did you last see her?" Timothy asked, his voice all business now. 3 days ago. She was supposed to come home after her shift at the mine office, but she never made it. We've been looking, but the storm—" Eugene's voice broke slightly. "She's all I got left in this world." Sarah felt her heart clench. She knew what it was like to be alone, to feel like you had nothing left to lose. But she also knew what it was like to be lost in these mountains, to face the cold, in the darkness, and the predators that hunted in the night. "We'll help," Timothy said, and Sarah heard the finality in his voice. "But I need to know everything, where she was last seen, who she was with, any enemies she might have had." "Enemies?" Eugene looked confused. "Linda doesn't have enemies. Everyone at the camp likes her." "Someone who might have wanted to hurt her," Ralph clarified, "or who might have seen her as an easy target." Eugene's face went pale. "You think someone took her? You think this wasn't an accident?" Timothy and Ralph exchanged another look, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air coming through the open door. They suspected foul play, though they weren't saying so directly. "We don't know anything yet," Timothy said carefully, "but we need to consider all possibilities." "There is one thing," Eugene said slowly. "There's been talk at the camp about strangers in the area, men who don't belong, who've been asking questions about the women who work there." "What kind of questions?" Ralph asked. "About their schedules, where they live, whether they have family nearby." "Jennifer Ramirez mentioned it to Linda a few days ago, said it made her uncomfortable." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Strangers asking about women, about their routines and their vulnerabilities. It painted a picture that made her skin crawl. "We need to go," Timothy said, moving toward his coat. "Every hour we wait makes it less likely we'll find her alive." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said, struggling to her feet. "No," Timothy's voice was flat and final. "You're staying here where it's safe." "I can help. I know what it's like to be lost in these mountains, to be alone and scared. If she's out there, if she's still alive." "You can't see," Timothy said bluntly. "You'll slow us down, and we can't afford that. Not when someone's life is at stake." The words hit her like physical blows, even though she knew they were true. She would be a liability in a search and rescue operation, another person who needed protection rather than someone who could provide help. But the thought of staying behind, of being useless while others risked their lives, made her feel sick. "Timothy's right," Ralph said more gently. "You need to rest that knee, and we need to move fast. You'll be safe here until we get back." Safe. The word felt hollow in her mouth. She would be safe, yes, but she would also be helpless. Another burden for others to worry about. Another person who needed taking care of. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. "Hard to say," Timothy replied, already putting on his heavy coat. "Could be a few hours, could be a few days." Depends on what we find. A few days. The thought of being alone in Ralph's cabin for that long, with nothing to do but wait and worry, made Sarah's chest tight with anxiety. But she also understood that she had no choice. This was what her life was now, waiting for others to make decisions, depending on their charity and goodwill, being grateful for whatever scraps of kindness they chose to offer. There's plenty of food, Ralph said, as if reading her thoughts. Firewood stacked by the hearth. You'll be comfortable until we return. Comfortable. Yes, she would be comfortable. Warm and fed and safe. Everything she had dreamed of during her 3 days in the wilderness. So why did it feel like a prison? Timothy paused by her chair, and she felt his hand touch her shoulder briefly. I know this is hard, he said quietly, but I need to know you're safe while I'm gone. I can't do what needs to be done if I'm worried about you. The admission surprised her. Timothy Allen, the man who claimed to want nothing to do with other people's problems, was worried about her. It should have been comforting, but instead, it made her feel more helpless than ever. Be careful, she said, wishing she could offer something more substantial than words. Always am. But Sarah heard the lie in his voice, knew that Timothy Allen was about to walk into danger with the same reckless determination that had gotten Joyce Flores killed. He was going to try to save someone again, despite the guilt and pain it had caused him before. The door closed behind the three men, leaving Sarah alone in the cabin with nothing but the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind around the walls. She sat in the sudden silence, listening to their voices fade as they moved away through the snow, and wondered if she would ever see Timothy Allen again. Outside, the storm had passed, but Sarah could sense that darker weather was coming. Not snow or wind, but something far more dangerous. Something that hunted women in the Montana wilderness and left no trace behind. And she was completely, utterly helpless to do anything about it. The hours crawled by like wounded animals, each minute stretching into an eternity of worry and helplessness. Sarah sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, listening to every sound that penetrated the cabin's walls. The wind had died to a whisper, but the silence felt more ominous than the storm's fury. In the quiet, her imagination conjured terrible scenarios. Timothy and Ralph lost in the wilderness, or worse, discovering Linda Hughes's frozen body in some remote ravine. She tried to occupy herself with small tasks, tending the fire, organizing the medical supplies Ralph had used to treat her wounds, even attempting to prepare a simple meal from the provisions she found in his kitchen. But everything reminded her of her limitations, of how dependent she had become on others for even the most basic survival. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart leap. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood, trying to determine if the voices belonged to Timothy and Ralph or to strangers with unknown intentions. The mining camps bred desperate men, and a woman alone in an isolated cabin would be seen as easy prey. Sarah, it's us, Timothy's voice called out, and she nearly collapsed with relief. She fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking as she opened the door. Cold air rushed in, along with the scent of snow and something else, the metallic smell of blood. Thank God you're back, she said, but stepping aside to let them enter. Did you find her? The silence that followed her question told her everything she needed to know. Timothy's footsteps were heavy as he moved past her, and she could hear Ralph breathing hard, as if he had been running. We found her, Timothy said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. She's alive. But hurt, Ralph added, and Sarah could hear him moving around the cabin, gathering supplies. Bad hurt. We need to get her warm and tend to her injuries. Sarah heard new footsteps, lighter and unsteady, supported by what sounded like Eugene Davis. A woman's voice, weak and trembling, spoke barely above a whisper. Please, I just want to go home. Linda Hughes, the missing woman, was alive, but Sarah could hear the trauma in her voice, the way it shook with more than just cold. Whatever had happened to her in the wilderness had left scars that would take far longer to heal than any physical wounds. You're safe now, Sarah said, moving toward the sound of Linda's voice. Let us help you. Who's that? Linda asked, fear sharpening her tone. A friend, Timothy said, Sarah Stewart. She's been staying here while we searched for you. Sarah felt her way carefully toward the group, her hands extended to avoid obstacles. When her fingers found Linda's arm, she felt the young woman flinch away from her touch. I can't see, Sarah explained gently, I lost my sight to fever, but I know what it's like to be afraid, to feel lost and alone. You're not alone anymore." Something in her voice seemed to reach Linda because the tension in her arm relaxed slightly. "I thought I was going to die out there," Linda whispered. "I thought no one would ever find me." "Tell us what happened," Ralph said, his voice gentle but insistent. "Who did this to you?" Sarah helped guide Linda to a chair by the fire while the men worked around them, stoking the flames and preparing hot food and drink. As warmth began to penetrate the cabin, Linda's story emerged in broken fragments. She had been walking home from the mining office 3 nights ago when two men had approached her. Strangers, as Eugene had suspected, who claimed to be looking for work at the mine. They had seemed friendly at first, asking directions to the camp supervisor's office. But when Linda had pointed them toward the main building, they had grabbed her. "They said they had been watching me," Linda continued, her voice barely audible above the fire's crackle. "Said they knew I lived alone. Knew I wouldn't be missed right away. They dragged me up into the mountains to some old prospector's shack." Sarah felt sick listening to the details that followed. The men had kept Linda tied up in the abandoned cabin, taking turns guarding her while the other went back to town to gather information about other women who worked at the mine. They had been planning something larger, more systematic than a single kidnapping. "What happened to them?" Timothy asked, and Sarah heard the dangerous edge in his voice. "The storm," Linda said. "Yesterday morning, one of them went out to check their horses and never came back. The other one went looking for him and got lost in the blizzard. I managed to get free from the ropes and started walking, but I didn't know which way to go. You're lucky we found you when we did," Ralph observed. "Another few hours in that cold, and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Linda Hughes had come within hours of freezing to death, alone and terrified in the wilderness. The thought made her stomach clench with sympathy and recognition. "The men," Timothy said. "Did you get a good look at them? Would you recognize them again?" "I'll never forget their faces," Linda replied, and there was steel in her voice now. "One of them had a scar across his cheek, like a knife cut. The other had a gold tooth in front. They called each other Marcus and Pete." Timothy and Ralph exchanged glances that Sarah couldn't see but could feel in the tension that suddenly filled the cabin. "You know them," she said. "We know of them," Timothy confirmed. "Marcus Webb and Pete Sullivan. They've been wanted for questioning in connection with several disappearances over the past year. Women from mining camps and small towns across the territory." The implications of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Linda Hughes hadn't been the victim of a random crime. She had been targeted by men who made a practice of hunting women, who had turned predation into a systematic enterprise. "Are they still out there?" Linda asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "Storm probably got them," Ralph said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Men like that, though, they're like cockroaches, hard to kill." Sarah heard Timothy moving around the cabin, checking his weapons and gathering supplies. "I'm going back out," he announced. "Need to make sure those men are really dead. And if they're not—" "You're not going alone," Ralph said firmly. "Someone needs to stay with the women." "Eugene can stay. This is personal now, Timothy. Those bastards have been terrorizing innocent people for too long." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the cabin's walls. Timothy was preparing to hunt the men who had taken Linda, and she could hear the same reckless determination in his voice that had gotten Joyce Flores killed. He was going to try to save someone again, to right a wrong that wasn't entirely his responsibility. "Don't go," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Timothy paused in his preparations. "They need to be stopped, Sarah. If they survive the storm, they'll just find more victims. Then let the law handle it. Send word to the territorial marshal. By the time help arrives, they'll be long gone. This is our chance to end it." Sarah heard the finality in his voice and knew that nothing she said would change his mind. Timothy Allen was a man driven by guilt and a desperate need to atone for past failures. He would risk everything to save people he barely knew, because that was who he was at his core. "At least wait until morning," she pleaded. "You've been searching all day. You need rest." "Every hour we wait gives them more time to recover, to plan their next move." Or to die from exposure, Ralph pointed out. Sarah's right, Timothy. We're no good to anyone if we collapse from exhaustion. The debate continued for several minutes, but Sarah could tell that Timothy's resolve was weakening. The physical demands of the search, combined with the emotional weight of finding Linda alive but traumatized, had taken their toll. Eventually, Ralph's practical arguments won out, and Timothy agreed to wait until dawn. The night passed slowly, filled with restless sleep and troubled dreams. Sarah dozed fitfully by the fire, starting awake at every sound. Beside her, Linda Hughes whimpered in her sleep, reliving the terror of her captivity. The men took turns standing watch, their vigilance a reminder that danger still lurked somewhere in the mountains. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold through the cabin's windows, Timothy was already preparing for the hunt. Sarah could hear him checking his rifle, counting ammunition, gathering supplies for what might be a long pursuit. "I want to come with you," she said suddenly. Timothy paused in his preparations. "Sarah, I know what you're going to say. I can't see. I'll slow you down. I'll be a liability. But I also know something you don't." "What's that?" "I know what it's like to be hunted, to feel helpless and afraid, to know that someone wants to hurt you just because they can. If those men are still alive, if they're planning to hurt more women, then I have as much right to stop them as anyone. You can't even see to aim a gun." "No, but I can listen. I can hear things you might miss, track sounds through the forest. My hearing has gotten better since I lost my sight. Much better." Timothy was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could feel him weighing her words against his protective instincts. She knew he wanted to keep her safe, to leave her behind where she couldn't be hurt. But she also knew that he understood the need for purpose, for the chance to fight back against the forces that had tried to destroy them. "It's too dangerous," he said finally. "Everything's dangerous. Living is dangerous. But I'm tired of being protected, Timothy. I'm tired of being helpless while other people fight my battles. This isn't your battle, isn't it? Those men prey on women they see as weak, as easy targets. Women like me, women like Linda. If I don't stand up to them, who will?" Ralph cleared his throat from across the cabin. "She has a point, Timothy, and we could use all the help we can get." "She's blind," Timothy said, as if Ralph had forgotten that crucial fact. "So are you, in a way. You're so focused on your guilt over Joyce Flores that you can't see straight. Maybe Sarah's perspective is exactly what we need." The words hit Timothy like a physical blow, and Sarah heard his sharp intake of breath. Ralph had struck at the heart of Timothy's pain, the wound that drove him to take impossible risks in pursuit of redemption. "That was uncalled for," Timothy said, his voice tight with anger. "Was it? Because from where I'm standing, you're about to make the same mistake you made 5 years ago. You're so desperate to save someone that you're not thinking clearly about the risks. Joyce died because I didn't act fast enough. Joyce died because her husband was a monster, and monsters don't respond to reason or kindness, just like these men were hunting. The difference is this time you're not alone. You have backup, and you have someone who understands what's at stake." Sarah felt the weight of both men's attention settling on her, and she straightened her shoulders under their scrutiny. "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. "I'm asking you to let me help protect others." Timothy was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation and something that might have been respect. "If you come with us, you follow orders without question. If I tell you to run, you run. If I tell you to hide, you hide. No arguments, no heroics. Understood?" "Understood." "And if something happens to me, Ralph gets you back to safety. That's not negotiable." Sarah nodded, though the thought of Timothy not returning made her chest tight with fear. In the few days she had known him, he had become more than just her rescuer. He had become her anchor in a world that had lost all familiar landmarks. They prepared for the hunt with grim efficiency. Timothy and Ralph checked their weapons and gathered ammunition, while Eugene agreed to stay behind with Linda, who was still too traumatized to be left alone. Sarah found herself equipped with a heavy coat and boots that were too large for her feet, but which would keep her warm and dry in the snow. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Linda caught Sarah's arm with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing that we deserve to be safe." The simple words hit Sarah harder than any elaborate speech could have. Here was a young woman who had been brutalized and terrorized, yet she still found the strength to express gratitude. It reminded Sarah of her own journey from victim to survivor, from helplessness to determination. "We all deserve to be safe," Sarah replied. "And we all deserve the chance to fight for that safety." The morning air was crisp and clean as they left the cabin, the snow crunching beneath their feet as they made their way through the forest. Sarah walked between Timothy and Ralph, her hands resting lightly on Timothy's arm for guidance, her ears straining to catch every sound that might indicate danger. The trail left by Linda's captors was easy to follow, even after the storm. Broken branches, disturbed snow, the occasional scrap of cloth caught on a thorn. They were following the path of desperate men, fugitives who had been more concerned with speed than stealth. "How far to the old prospector's shack?" Sarah asked softly. "About 2 miles," Timothy replied. "Up near the old silver claim that played out 10 years ago." Sarah had heard stories about the abandoned mining claims that dotted the Montana mountains, the dreams of wealth that had drawn men into the wilderness only to leave them broken and empty-handed. It seemed fitting that such a place would become a lair for predators who fed on others' vulnerability. They walked in relative silence, the only sounds the whisper of their footsteps through the snow and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah found herself focusing on the rhythm of their movement, the way Timothy's breathing changed when he spotted something significant, the subtle shifts in Ralph's posture that indicated heightened alertness. "Blood," Timothy said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah heard both men stop, and she felt Timothy's arm tense beneath her hand. "How much?" Ralph asked. "Enough. Looks like one of them got hurt bad during the storm." They followed the blood trail through the forest, dark stains against the pristine snow that told a story of desperation and pain. Sarah found herself hoping that the men had died from their injuries, that justice had been served by the mountain's harsh indifference. But she also knew that evil had a way of surviving when good people perished. "There," Ralph said, his voice tight with tension. "The shack." Sarah couldn't see the structure, but she could sense its presence in the way sound changed around them. The echo of their footsteps, the subtle shift in the wind's pattern. They were approaching something solid, something that blocked the natural flow of air through the forest. "Smoke," Timothy observed. "Someone's alive in there." The smell reached Sarah a moment later, the acrid scent of burning wood mixed with something else, something that made her stomach clench with revulsion. The smell of unwashed bodies, of fear and desperation and violence. "2 of them, you think?" Ralph asked. "Hard to say. Could be one, could be both. Could be someone else entirely." Sarah felt Timothy's muscles coil with tension as he prepared for confrontation. This was the moment he had been building toward, the chance to face the predators who had terrorized innocent women. She could hear his breathing change, becoming deeper and more controlled, the breathing of a man preparing for battle. "Remember what we discussed," he said quietly. "Stay behind us, stay quiet, and be ready to run if things go bad." Sarah nodded, though her heart was hammering with more than just fear. She was terrified, yes, but she was also angry. Angry at the men who had hurt Linda, angry at the world that made women into prey, angry at her own helplessness in the face of such cruelty. They approached the shack with careful steps, using the trees for cover as they closed the distance. Sarah could hear voices now, low and urgent, coming from inside the structure. 2 men arguing about something in tones too quiet for her to make out the words. Timothy raised his rifle, and Sarah heard the soft click of the safety being released. Beside him, Ralph did the same, their movements coordinated by years of partnership and shared purpose. "Marcus Webb, Pete Sullivan," Timothy called out, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "This is the law. Come out with your hands up." The voices inside the shack stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of scrambling movement. Sarah heard furniture being overturned, the scrape of metal against wood, the harsh whisper of desperate men preparing for a fight they couldn't win. "We know you're in there," Ralph added. We know what you did to Linda Hughes and the other women. It's over. A gunshot exploded from inside the shack, the bullet splintering wood somewhere to Sarah's left. Timothy pushed her down behind a fallen log, his body shielding her from the line of fire. Stay down, he commanded, and then he was moving, using the trees for cover as he flanked the building. More gunshots followed, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the forest. Sarah pressed herself against the frozen ground, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. This was what violence sounded like, she realized. Not the clean, decisive confrontations she had imagined, but chaos and confusion and the constant threat of death. The gunfight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah as she crouched behind the log, listening to the deadly conversation of weapons in the morning air. She could track Timothy's movement by the sound of his rifle, could hear Ralph circling around to the back of the shack, cutting off any escape route. "Give it up," Timothy called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "You're surrounded and you're hurt. This doesn't have to end with more blood." "Go to hell," came the reply, followed by another wild shot that went wide of any target. Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of footsteps moving through the snow, coming from a direction that neither Timothy nor Ralph was watching. A third person, moving with the careful stealth of someone trying to avoid detection. "Timothy," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the forest. "Behind you, to the left." Timothy spun around just as a figure emerged from the trees, rifle raised and ready to fire. The shot that followed was so close to Sarah that she felt the heat of the muzzle flash, but Timothy's return fire was faster and more accurate. The figure dropped into the snow and didn't move again. "Thank you," Timothy called back to her, and Sarah heard genuine gratitude in his voice. The remaining gunmen in the shack seemed to lose heart after watching their companion fall. The shooting stopped, replaced by urgent whispers and the sound of someone moving around inside the structure. "Last chance," Ralph called out. "Throw out your weapons and come out with your hands up." A rifle came flying out of the shack's doorway, followed by a pistol. Two men emerged slowly, their hands raised, their faces pale with fear and pain. Sarah couldn't see them, but she could hear their labored breathing, could smell the blood and desperation that clung to them like a second skin. "Marcus Webb and Pete Sullivan," Timothy said, his voice hard as granite. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder." "We didn't kill nobody," one of the men protested, his voice high with panic. "No, but you would have," Ralph replied. "Linda Hughes and God knows how many other women. You're lucky we found you before you had the chance." Sarah heard the sound of ropes being tied, of the two men being secured for transport back to civilization, and whatever justice awaited them there. It was over, she realized. The immediate threat had been eliminated, the predators captured or killed. But as she stood up from behind the log, brushing snow from her coat, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. She had faced danger and hadn't run. She had contributed to the fight, had played a role in bringing these men to justice. For the first time since losing her sight, she felt truly useful. "You did good back there," Timothy said, appearing at her side with that silent way he had of moving. "That warning saved my life." "I told you I could help," Sarah replied, and there was quiet pride in her voice. "Yes, you did. I should have listened sooner." They made their way back to Ralph's cabin with their prisoners, the two wounded men stumbling through the snow under guard. Sarah walked with more confidence now, her hand resting lightly on Timothy's arm, but not gripping it with the desperate dependence she had shown before. Linda Hughes wept when she saw her captors in custody, tears of relief and vindication that spoke to the justice that had finally been served. Eugene Davis embraced his daughter with fierce gratitude, thanking Timothy and Ralph repeatedly for bringing her home safe. But it was Timothy's quiet words to Sarah, spoken as they prepared to finally continue their journey to his cabin, that meant the most to her. "I was wrong about you," he said. "You're not broken and you're not helpless. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." "I'm learning to be," Sarah replied, "with help from someone who understands what it means to carry guilt that isn't entirely yours to bear." Timothy was quiet for a long moment. "Joyce Flores," he said finally. "You couldn't save her because she wasn't ready to be saved. That doesn't make her death your fault." I keep telling myself that. Maybe it's time to start believing it. They left Ralph's cabin the next morning, with Linda Hughes safely reunited with her father and the captured men secured for transport to the territorial authorities. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clear and bright, promising better weather ahead. Timothy's cabin, when they finally reached it, was everything he had promised. Simple but well-built, warm and dry, with enough supplies to last through the winter. Sarah explored the single room carefully, learning the layout by touch, claiming a space by the fire that would be hers for as long as she needed it. "It's not much," Timothy said, watching her settle in. "It's perfect," Sarah replied, and meant it. This wasn't just shelter from the storm. It was a place where she could heal, where she could learn to be strong in new ways, where she could discover what kind of woman she was meant to become. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal, Timothy asked the question that had been hanging between them since their first meeting in the forest. "What will you do when spring comes, when the pass is clear and you can travel again?" Sarah had been thinking about that question for days, weighing possibilities against probabilities, dreams against practical realities. She could return to Denver, try to rebuild the life that had been shattered by fever and abandonment. She could find some other city, some other place where blind women might find work and purpose. Or she could stay. "I don't know," she said honestly. "What would you want me to do?" Timothy was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire with the expression of a man wrestling with his own demons. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and uncertain. "I'd want you to stay, but I don't know if I have the right to ask that of you." "Why wouldn't you?" "Because I'm not an easy man to live with. Because I have bad days when the guilt gets too heavy and I'm not fit company for anyone. Because you deserve better than a broken-down lawman hiding in the mountains." Sarah reached across the space between them, her fingers finding his hand in the flickering firelight. His skin was warm and calloused, marked by years of hard work and harder choices. "You saved my life," she said simply. "Not just from the cold or the wolves, but from believing that being broken meant being worthless. You showed me that strength comes in different forms, that being damaged doesn't mean being defeated. You did that yourself. I just didn't get in your way. You did more than that. You saw something in me that I had forgotten was there. You treated me like a person instead of a burden." Timothy's fingers tightened around hers, and Sarah felt the tremor that ran through him at her words. Here was a man who had spent years believing himself to be a failure, who had hidden in the wilderness rather than risk hurting someone else through his perceived inadequacy. "I'm not the man I used to be," he said quietly. "Neither am I the woman I used to be. Maybe that's not a bad thing." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the fire burn low in the hearth. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, but it no longer sounded threatening. It sounded like home. Spring came slowly to the Montana mountains, creeping up the valleys like a cautious animal testing the air for danger. Sarah felt it first in the quality of the light that filtered through the cabin's windows, then in the sound of water running beneath the ice, and finally in the sweet scent of new growth that rode the warming breeze. She had spent the winter months learning to navigate Timothy's world with growing confidence. Her hands knew every inch of the cabin now, could find any tool or supply without hesitation. Her ears had become attuned to the subtle sounds that warned of weather changes or approaching wildlife. Most importantly, her heart had learned to trust again. Timothy had been true to his word about having bad days. There were mornings when he woke with Joyce Flores' name on his lips, afternoons when he sat staring into the fire with eyes that saw nothing but past failures. But Sarah had learned to recognize these moods, to offer quiet companionship without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. In return, Timothy had watched her transform from a broken woman seeking death in the wilderness to someone who faced each day with quiet determination. He had seen her learn to cook over an open fire, to mend clothes by touch, to split kindling with careful precision. More importantly, he had seen her learn to value herself again. "The passes will be clear soon," he said one morning in late April, his voice carefully neutral as he prepared their breakfast. Sarah nodded, her hands busy with mending a tear in one of his shirts. "Ralph stopped by yesterday while you were checking the trap lines. He said the snow's melting fast this year." "Did he say anything else?" He asked if I'd made any decisions about the future. Timothy's movements stilled, and Sarah could feel his attention focusing on her with laser intensity. This conversation had been building for weeks, hovering between them like smoke from the fire. "Have you?" he asked. Sarah set down her mending and turned toward the sound of his voice. "That depends on whether you meant what you said that night by the fire, about wanting me to stay." "I meant it, but I also meant what I said about you deserving better." "Better than what? Better than that man who risked his life to save a stranger? Better than someone who sees strength where others see weakness? Better than a partner who understands that healing takes time? Better than a man who's still carrying ghosts?" Sarah stood and moved toward him, her steps sure and confident in the familiar space. When she reached him, she placed her hands on either side of his face, feeling the rough texture of his beard, the warmth of his skin. "We're all carrying ghosts, Timothy. The question is whether we let them haunt us or whether we learn to live with them." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if her hands could somehow absorb the pain he carried. "I don't want to hurt you the way I hurt Joyce." "You didn't hurt Joyce, her husband did. You tried to save her, and when you couldn't, you blamed yourself for forces beyond your control." "What if I can't protect you? What if something happens and I fail again?" Sarah smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that spread through her chest whenever Timothy revealed his vulnerable side. "Then you fail, and we deal with whatever comes after. But you don't get to make that decision for me, Timothy Allen. You don't get to decide what risks I'm willing to take." "I love you, Bai," he said suddenly, the words torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I love you, Bai, and that terrifies me." "I love you too," Sarah replied, her voice steady and sure. "And that doesn't terrify me at all. It makes me feel alive." They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony performed by Ralph Wood in his capacity as a territorial magistrate. Linda Hughes and her father were there, along with a handful of other neighbors from the scattered mining camps and homesteads. It wasn't the wedding Sarah had once dreamed of, with white lace and formal vows and a church full of well-wishers. It was better. As Timothy slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the fever that had taken her sight, the abandonment that had driven her into the wilderness, the accident that had left her alone and dying in the snow. Each tragedy had seemed like an ending at the time, but they had actually been beginnings, steps on a path that led not to death, but to a life more authentic and meaningful than anything she had known before. "You may kiss the bride," Ralph announced with obvious satisfaction. Timothy's lips were warm and gentle against hers, a promise of partnership and protection that had nothing to do with pity or obligation. When they broke apart, Sarah heard the sound of applause and well-wishes from their small gathering of friends. "So, what now, Mrs. Allen?" Timothy asked, his voice light with happiness she had never heard before. "Now we go home," Sarah replied, "and we build a life together." Home was the cabin in the mountains, but it was also something larger and more encompassing. It was the trust they had built through shared hardship, the love that had grown from mutual respect and understanding. It was the knowledge that they were both damaged people who had found wholeness in each other's company. That summer, Sarah planted a garden behind the cabin, her hands learning to distinguish between seedlings and weeds by touch and smell. Timothy built additional rooms, expanding their simple shelter into something that could accommodate the future they were planning together. They talked about children, about the possibility of starting a school for the scattered families in the area, about growing old together in the place where they had found each other. But it was on a crisp autumn evening, as they sat by the fire watching the flames dance in the hearth, that Sarah truly understood how far she had traveled from the broken woman who had sought death in the wilderness. "Do you ever regret it?" Timothy asked, his voice thoughtful in the firelight. "Staying here instead of going back to civilization?" Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about the life she might have had in Denver or some other city, the charitable organizations that might have found her work, the boarding houses where she might have lived as a permanent resident dependent on others' goodwill. It would have been safe, predictable, and utterly without purpose. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it at all. In the city, I would have been Sarah Stewart, the blind woman who needed help with everything. Here, I'm Sarah Allen, Timothy's wife, who happens to be blind but is perfectly capable of taking care of herself and others. The difference matters. The difference is everything. Timothy reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I used to think that loving someone meant protecting them from everything that could hurt them. But you've taught me that real love means trusting someone to be strong enough to handle whatever comes. And you've taught me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that have been cracked and mended. Outside their cabin, the Montana wind sang through the pine trees with the voice of approaching winter. But inside, by the fire they had built together, Sarah Stewart Allen sat with her husband and felt nothing but warmth. She had come to the mountains seeking death and had found life instead. She had lost her sight and gained a vision of what she was truly capable of becoming. The scars were still there on her face and in her heart. They always would be, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they were simply part of her story, proof that she had survived everything the world had thrown at her and emerged stronger on the other side. As the fire burned low and they prepared for bed, Timothy spoke the words that had become their nightly ritual. "I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you asked me to. Even though you can't see me?" Sarah smiled, hearing the echo of their first conversation in the forest, when she had told him she was blind and he had replied that she wouldn't see him cry. Now she understood what he had meant. Not that he was ashamed of his emotions, but that he was a man who had learned to hide his pain from the world. "Especially because I can't see you," she replied, her voice warm with love and gentle humor. "It means I have to judge you by your actions instead of your appearance. And your actions, Timothy Allen, are those of the finest man I've ever known." They banked the fire and made their way to bed, two people who had found in each other something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Outside, the first snow of the new winter began to fall, but neither of them was afraid of the cold anymore. They had each other, and they had learned that love was not about being perfect or undamaged. It was about being willing to share your scars with someone who understood that healing was not about forgetting the past, but about building a future that honored what you had survived. In the morning, there would be work to do, challenges to face, and the daily business of building a life together in a place where survival required constant vigilance and mutual dependence. But tonight, Sarah Allen fell asleep in her husband's arms, grateful for the fever that had taken her sight, the accident that had left her alone in the wilderness, and the mountain man who had seen strength where others saw only weakness. She had whispered that she was blind, that no man would want that, and Timothy Allen had replied that she wouldn't see him cry. But in the end, there had been no tears of sorrow, only tears of joy for two people who had found their way home to each other through the darkness.